Okay. All right. Thank you, Ashley. Thanks for having me, everybody. Can everybody see my screen? Well, I guess everyone's not going to unmute themselves. But Ashley, I'm sure you tell me if I
I
need to.
can. Is it in presenter mode in your screen? Yep, that's
It
actually
is.
perfect.
Okay. So yes, like Ashley said, I'm going to talk to you about the program that I've been working on for about, well, almost 12 years now with the Department of Corrections here in Iowa. And it is focused on preventing and intervening with people who have caused harm or been arrested, charged for domestic assault is the primary purpose of the program. The program is called ACTIVE. That is a short way of saying it. The long version is Achieving Change Through Values-Based Behavior, which is a mouthful, so we mostly just say ACTIVE. So I will tell you more about the program in a few minutes, but I'm going to provide the background for how developing this program even came about. So just quickly, domestic violence is obviously a big problem. It has become even more so in the past 6 weeks because of COVID. Domestic violence arrests and charges are up 85% based on my last call with them yesterday. But even before that, it was a significant problem. 95% of children living in homes with DV are directly exposed, and many experts in the field have reached consensus that being exposed to violence is one of the strongest risk factors for then transmitting that violent behavior from one generation to the next. So it really has a ripple effect not only on the victims themselves, which of course is a significant impact on them psychologically and physically, but the children in those homes and by extension families in whole. So one thing I noticed when I was in graduate school and started becoming interested in domestic violence is that there's so much research on the characteristics of these people who perpetrate and what are their personality traits and what are the risk factors and what are their cognitions, what are their emotions, and all this basic research, which is great and fine. However, I was just struck by the fact that was so little progress made in terms of treatment. And despite the thousands and thousands and thousands of articles on the characteristics of these perpetrators and who they are, virtually no progress had been made in terms of treating people who had committed the violence. So that's what got me interested in it, because people often ask me why I got interested in it. And that's what I learned in graduate school, and what really kind of hooked me in was like, I want to try to find something that can work because so little progress had been made. So just a little historical context to set up, which it may not seem relevant, but it'll be relevant here in a minute. So the historical context of domestic violence in this country is that it was really, in a sense, brought into our country and held up by European acceptance of male supremacy, which what that looked like in the 1800s and early 1900s was essentially that, husbands own their wives, and really what happens in the home is their business. It's a husband's right to physically abuse his wife. And that any domestic violence that goes on is really a family matter. In other words, it's not a societal issue. It's not a criminal issue. It's not a psychological issue. It's really a family matter that needs to be taken care of behind closed doors. And so that belief perpetuated, and that societal structure perpetuated until really the late 70s and early 80s, when feminist activists began actually initiating reform. And what that looked like was implementing laws that make domestic assaults and domestic violence against the law. And then all sorts of other things like victim services, educating law enforcement and judges and things and people like that about domestic violence and how to appropriately sentence and things like that. So that's what initiated domestic violence even becoming a criminal justice issue. I mean, it is still a family issue, to be sure, but it is also a criminal justice issue. So the primary intervention model that emerged in the 1980s was called the Duluth Model, and it's still the most widespread model of domestic violence used today. It is really a sociological model, and it is based on a community approach to holding perpetrators accountable and keeping victims safe. So kind of like how I just described, there are many facets of the Duluth model. There's victim services, coordinated community response among all the agencies involved, victim advocates, judges, police officers, criminal justice system, corrections, and they all are intended to work together to intervene with domestic violence. And the philosophy behind this program is that men's violence is caused by patriarchal ideology or men's desire to have power and control over women. So the model is sort of based on this assumption that men's violence is done out of this premeditated or preconditioned societal sanctioning of men's control and owning of women. And so the Duluth model component that focuses on perpetrators specifically, which is called men's nonviolence classes, they sort of use oppression and slavery as an example of how, men have this oppressive power over women. So what men's nonviolence classes are called, they're called many different things, but the most common thing in the research literature is Batterers Intervention Programs, or BIPs. That's the most common name, but they're also called Batterers Education Groups, Batterers Education Programs. I mean, there's lots of different names, but BIPs is the most common. And by law, most states mandate that any person, it started off any man, but now it's really any person who is convicted of domestic assault needs to complete one of these Batterers intervention programs. And the idea behind these programs is not only to get them to stop being violent, but the purpose was also to subvert all these people from going to prison. Because if everyone that was convicted of domestic assault went to prison, that'd be a huge problem in terms of prison population, but also because that separates families. And the actually original goal or partial goal of these groups was to prevent jail time and prevent prison time so that families could stay together. Because if you think about it, if, husbands or dads are put in prison, that would actually put a huge financial strain on some families, or all families, you could argue. So the idea was to prevent that from happening and to keep families intact. So as it is right now in all states, if your first time offense for domestic assault, unless you've got, a pretty significant criminal history, that won't land you in prison. You will be sentenced and you will be court mandated to complete a Batterers intervention program in the community. And people get confused about this a lot because they think all these people are in prison. Well, they're not really. It's only a felony if it's your third time offense, or if it gets to the level of like attempted murder. So something like strangulation, if that's involved, would be a felony, and then you could have prison time. But 90% of domestic assaults are not in that category and will not get you prison time. Something like throwing a bag of chips at your spouse is technically domestic assault and can get you convicted. So, that's kind of an extreme example, but I've seen it happen. So, almost every state mandates that these programs exist and that people convicted of domestic assault must complete them. And so most current Batterers intervention programs are based on the Duluth model and cognitive behavioral principles. So cognitive behavioral principles are kind of baked into the Duluth model men's nonviolence classes. But over the years, they've sort of added more of cognitive behavioral techniques, sort of change your thinking to change your behavior. And you must, unlearn all those thoughts you have about women and men's power over women for you to stop being violent. That's what, by and large, what these groups focus on. But to skip to the most important bottom line, these programs don't work. So the best really version of all the meta-analyses is that a man who has been arrested, sanctioned, and completed one of these programs is only about 5% less likely to recommit domestic assault than a man who has been arrested and sanctioned and not completed one of these programs. So that's a very small effect size. So as you can see, just to put it in perspective on this slide, point on the bottom are reference points for small, medium, and large effect sizes in case you aren't familiar with what those are. But just as a reference point, I'm not saying BIPs are anything like therapy. They're not, but just as a comparison, normal psychotherapy typically has large effect sizes. Substance abuse treatment, a little bit lower, more in the medium range. Other offender rehabilitation programs, which are quite common, start getting into the smaller range, but BIPs are by and large the least effective of all of these types of programs, with effect sizes about the 0.1 range. And again, that's kind of like the best case scenario is the 0.1 effect size. So again, this is sort of these meta-analyses and these data are what kind of hooked me into wanting to research this and develop something that could improve the field of domestic violence treatment. So I'm just going to now switch gears a little bit to tell you a little bit about where the domestic violence program is embedded, because a lot of people don't know about this, and I didn't really before I got involved with the Department of Corrections here in Iowa. So there's three main components of the criminal justice system. One, which is law enforcement, and that's what I already told you about. If someone is arrested for domestic violence, that would be done by law enforcement. And then they'd move to the court system, which would do the sentencing or the adjudicating, where their sentence would involve being mandated to complete a batterers intervention program. Then that's when sort of the Department of Corrections, in essence, has custody of the person then, whether they're incarcerated or not. If they're not incarcerated, they're typically taking these classes in what's called community-based corrections. So these are your people who are on probation, parole. Some of them may not even be on probation, but they're still taking these classes in the community. So they're not institutionalized, they're not prisoners, but they are in effect, the Department of Corrections has jurisdiction over them. They either have to be checking in with a probation officer, they have to be checking in with the courts, they have to be proving to someone that they are taking the batterers intervention program as part of their sentencing. So corrections really has nothing to do with the laws. They don't have anything to do with the sentencing. They really get these folks after all that has been done. And so, like I said, Department of Corrections includes community-based corrections and prisons. And I originally developed Active with community-based corrections in mind. It is now being run in prisons as well, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But community-based corrections was where I originally worked within to develop this program. So what this looked like was, actually I think it was way back in 2009, the Iowa Department of Corrections did their own cost benefit analysis of the batterers intervention programs in Iowa. And they were based on Duluth and CBT at that time, and had been for a couple decades. And they figured out that BIPs were the only correctional program wasting taxpayer dollars in the red. And they basically decided to scrap using Duluth and CBT, which was quite unprecedented, by the way. No other state has really gotten the courage to do that because it's a very political issue. And they reached out to researchers at the University of Iowa, which is where I was a graduate student at the time. And I was working on my dissertation, developing a, kind of a smaller scale protocol for partner aggression, domestic violence treatment. And it was just really good timing. And so I started working with them, and I worked collaboratively with them. I had a protocol already written, but, I had it written for clinical psychologists in a laboratory setting, which is, obviously extremely different than the Department of Corrections setting. And so I worked collaboratively with the practitioners for almost 2 years. I ran groups myself. I got in there, I interviewed the people who had been convicted of domestic assault. I interviewed the line staff, the Department of Corrections staff who actually facilitate these programs, because they're obviously integral to this whole thing working. And so I did that for 2 full years. That was like all I did besides my dissertation. And we started pilot testing and training in 2011, and that took about 2 years before it started. Just almost the entire state of Iowa started using the program. And this was all before, I could get the research done. I was hurrying as fast as I could to get the research done, but the Department of Corrections just ran with it before I could even, really get any research published. But I'll talk more about that later. So what I basically did was work it started off top bottom, really. The administration had to be on board first. There was a woman, Ann Brown, she has since retired, but she was really the person that I worked with most closely. She was director of the Batterers intervention programs in Iowa at the time. She was appointed by Branstad, 3 decades prior. And she was really the one that was basically like, do what you need to do. Duluth CBT obviously wasn't working. We need to just do something different. And, it's so interesting because looking back, that was quite brazen. But without her just willingness to scrap the old and go in with the new, this would have never happened. I mean, she was really the entry point for this happening. But then I got in, and I did the hard work and had blood, sweat, and tears to get it going. But really, without her allowing it to happen from an administrative level, it wouldn't have. So with her buy-in, I was allowed to then kind of work from the bottom up. So then I had to get the buy-in of the line staff, and I'll talk more about that. But I discovered that each level had different, types and intensity of resistance to change. But the one that I think is most relevant to my work is that they want evidence-based practice and they value it and they value research, but they kind of want me to just do it, well, in their way. And that makes total sense, but it took years for me to understand what their way was and what was able to be compromised on and what wasn't. So I'll give a couple examples. One was the structure of the program in terms of sessions. So, ideally in my mind, and research has actually borne this out, ideally programs should be everyone in the program, an ideal group size is 8 to 10. Well, they wanted groups of like 15 to 20. Okay, so we compromised on 12. I would bring the evidence-based research piece and they would kind of counter with what they needed. And then we'd kind of, had like somewhat kind of just reach a compromise. So another example is my idea was having 8 to 10 participants start at the same time and going through all together and then ending at the same time. Well, no, that wasn't going to fly either. They had to have people come in at any session just based on the way their waiting lists are. And in some ways I get it, because you don't want people waiting very long in between when they're sentenced to complete the program and when they start, because that's just more time for them to become violent, right? And so I understood that. But again, from my evidence-based research angle, cohorts of individuals and in groups is so much more effective than people coming in at any session. Well, whatever, we compromised on that, and really we didn't compromise. It was just, anyone can enter in at any of the 24 sessions of active. And it took a long time to kind of figure out how that was going to work. And, different districts kind of do different things. I'll explain that in a minute. But every time we would just need to talk about the pros and cons and figure out, how can we do this in an evidence-based way, as close as possible to evidence-based, while also keeping in mind the needs and the context of where we're working, of course. So these are the 24 active sessions. I'm really not going to talk much about session content for this talk, but if you're interested, here they are. We do include an active, power and control and men's, belief. If they do believe that they have power over women and that is contributing to their violence, we address that. But we also address a multitude of other causes of domestic violence that have been shown in the literature that just weren't addressed by Duluth. The Duluth model doesn't believe that trauma or emotion has anything to do with violence. And, the research really is very clear that those things are, heavily involved in someone becoming violent. So, we sort of scrapped all those old beliefs and it started instead addressing all the different things that can possibly contribute to someone being violent. So again, I'm not going to talk too much about the theory and underlying the treatment of active, but it's based on acceptance and commitment therapy, which I was trained heavily in this approach when I was in graduate school. But really, acceptance and commitment therapy has been used in so many different contexts, in schools and hospitals, in developing countries, for people with autism, for self-harm, for smoking. It's been used, it's a transdiagnostic treatment that has been used across so many different fields. And I mostly call it acceptance and commitment training when I'm working with corrections, because it's not, the therapy is not being used in this program, but the principles underlying it and the process-based approach that is acceptance and commitment therapy is, the spirit of the active program. And like I said earlier, we address multiple factors that contribute to domestic violence, from trauma, power and control, emotion dysregulation, attachment deficits that often are a result of experiencing trauma, unhealthy or maladaptive beliefs or thoughts, and then practicing those skills. We practice those skills in session, because we've learned that if they don't practice them in session, then they won't be able to employ those skills outside of session. So the sessions are very experiential, and the facilitators are trained to actually get the participants in group feeling whatever they often feel when they're in an argument with their partner, and then to use skills while it's happening. So one of the main ways that active differs from previous programs that have been used for domestic violence is the facilitator's behavior. So, and remember, these are Department of Corrections employees, and so they have no training in behavior change, really. Most of them have a 4-year degree in something peripherally related, maybe. Some of them are psychology majors, a lot of them criminal justice or sociology or related fields, and they don't really have a lot of training in behavior change. And the research also shows that people who go work for the Department of Corrections tend to be a bit more punitive than your average person. And so this is at odds with the way active is set up. So active is set up not to be punitive, but to be collaborative and compassionate with the participants. And so what to me shifted from how are we going to teach offenders these concepts, what really the challenge has been for the past 10 years is how do I teach the facilitators these principles. So there's kind of parallel processes going on. It's me training the facilitators to do these things so that they can then be that way with the clients. And so how they treat participants, how they regulate their own emotions, what are their beliefs and assumptions about the clients in front of them, how do they address conflict? For many of them, a trigger is when the clients do not take responsibility or they are not held accountable for their crime. That is a trigger for a lot of the Department of Corrections staff. And so it's me working with them to learn to let that go if it's not in service of furthering the goal, which is to help the client become nonviolent. And so it's a lot of letting go of their own stuff, for another way to put it. And that has been actually the primary focus of my work for 10 years, is how to help the corrections line staff be able to facilitate this program. The content itself is not complicated. I mean, it's definitely different than other correctional programs for sure, but but I wouldn't say the content is, revolutionary. It's really the way that the facilitators behave that is so different, and what I would say is the crux of how the effectiveness of this program is based on that. So like I already talked a little bit about, the implementation depended heavily on getting the line staff on board. And I won't bore you with the details, but I mean, it was blood, sweat, and tears for years to get them on board, to get my champions, and to help, and then to have my champions help me then bring other trainers on board so that it wasn't just me. It was really about talking about what's in it for them. And what I discovered is that what's in it for them with this program is the flexibility. It is not, you don't have to read out of the book, as long as you're teaching them the process or the principle in that session, you're good from an active perspective. And they're used to having to read out of the book with other correctional programs. And, line staff, they don't like that. And I don't blame them. It's boring. I mean, some of the line staff facilitate 10 groups a week. And that gets boring. They lose their passion for the job. And so what was in it for them is active, having that flexibility. And then the second thing that was in it for them is that many of them started reporting it was changing their own lives, and that they were, using the principles and practicing it in their own lives, which I tell them during training that they need to do, otherwise it will fall flat. Well, they started doing that, and they started getting on board when they saw the changes in their own life. And so that connecting with that piece of it and really emphasizing that was helpful in getting more people on board. And then I involved them in the process. Like I said, it was 2 years that it took me to really get the first manual done. And that was done with input from the line staff and the practitioners who are actually working with this population every day. I was there and I led groups myself for a couple of years, but some of these people have been working with this population for decades, and I trusted their experience and their wisdom, and we worked collaboratively on that. And then the last thing that helped with the implementation was, I didn't really talk much research with them. I could tell as soon as I would start talking about research, eyes would glaze over and they'd become uninterested. And so I would find ways to sneak in, evidence-based methods and things like that, but always talk about them again in ways that what's in it for them, how is this going to make things better for them? And then, I would obviously throw in how it's going to work better to decrease domestic assault as well. But I definitely don't ever talk about methods or statistics. You will completely lose people. And then, give them the relevance and the impact of these practices and why we're doing this from that perspective. And that's how, I got people to listen to me and trust me. And really what that is, as this diagram shows, it's really evidence-informed practice. At this point, active was not evidence-based, because an evidence-based program needs to be, proven to work in 2 randomized controlled trials. And at this point, we weren't there. In fact, I'm just finishing up the first randomized controlled trial now. And so at the point this was being developed and implemented, it was really evidence-informed practice at that point, just that we were using, evidence as the basis for our decisions and what we were doing. But the program itself is not yet evidence-based. So training is a huge part. I won't talk too much about it because I want to make sure we have time for questions at the end. But each level of training I'm heavily involved in the initial training for line staff, which is 3 days. We do about 4 of those per year. It's called a pre-service. Each time there's 30 to 40 trainees attending. I would like to get that down, but again, that's where me and the Department of Corrections often compromise. They want more people trained every year. So then after they are trained for 3 days, they then go off and start facilitating their first active group, which takes 6 months because the 24 sessions are once a week. And so during those first 6 months of leading the program, they are coached by someone who has been, certified by me as someone who is an active expert and is able to, it's another Department of Corrections employee. I coach when necessary, but my main task is to supervise the coaches and make sure that the coaches are doing what they need to do when they're supervising their trainees. So I have weekly or monthly subcommittee meetings with coaches, and then 1 time a year I train new coaches. Typically in the summer I have one day training for how to be a coach, and that's for people who are already what I deem active, pretty close to having expertise in active, having facilitated at least twice by themselves. And then finally, I have trainers, or what we call TOTs, train the trainers. They help me with pre-services and training coaches. I only have a handful of them. There's been, a lot of retirements over the past several years of people who are my core people from the very beginning. And so I only have about a handful of trainers at this point. And I'm working on building the bench and getting more of those to help me run the pre-services. So this is all the sites of where active is being implemented right now. So the red diamonds are community-based corrections sites. So they're probation or parole offices. The one in Ames is behind the Burger King on Lincoln Way, a very unassuming building. Fort Dodge has a brand new, beautiful 3-story building for their community-based corrections. In Des Moines, it's the old Dowling High School. Just north of downtown Des Moines. So community-based corrections can look a lot of different ways. And then the blue stars are prisons. So a couple of years ago, they started also implementing active in the prisons, which I won't get into that too much because that's a whole kind of other presentation, but all 9 prisons now run active as well. And that's for people who have an outstanding domestic assault charge. And usually they ended up in prison for something else. Although, like I said, some people, if it's, their 3rd domestic assault or, a felony domestic assault, then they will go to prison and they will still have the BIP requirement. And so they started running active in the prisons a few years ago. So these are all the sites that I try to keep track of, but I'm not successful because I am only one person, and I, do have other responsibilities and research, of course, but I try to keep track of all these as best I can in terms of where they are and what their needs are on a, daily basis. So I'm gonna just give you some quick results from the first study that I did on active. So this was in community-based corrections only, and it was a retrospective look at Duluth CBT versus active. So there were a couple years, those 2011 to 2013, where both programs were running because active was being disseminated across the state, but somewhat slowly, and that it took 3 or 4 years. So Duluth CBT were still running in some sites, or at some sites. And so I did a retrospective look at that, and they were not randomized, but this provided sort of preliminary data to get grant money to do a randomized controlled trial, which I'm doing now. So the 1 year recidivism, which recidivism I defined as any new criminal charges 1 year after completing the program, either Duluth, CBT, or active. So the blue bars represent the new charge rate or recidivism at 1 year for Duluth CBT, and then red is active. So I looked at any charges just because I thought that was interesting. Even though active targets domestic assault, I was, interested to see if it reduced general criminal charges, and it did by 24%, domestic assault by 31%, and any violent charges. So that includes domestic assault, but also like child abuse, robbery, anything violent. It actually had the biggest effect there and reduced those charges by 37%. So what that means in Iowa specifically, based on where we typically hover in terms of number of domestic assaults, that equates to about 1,500 fewer assaults per year. And again, these data were collected 2011 to 2013, so they're somewhat old by now. But I also did a 5-year follow-up just to make sure that the 1 year results held up, and thankfully they did, except for any charges. So by the 5-year mark, active participants had somewhat caught up to Duluth participants, and any charges were about the same. I actually don't have those numbers on me, but they were about the same, about 50% by the 5-year mark. But active still did significantly better for domestic assault charges and any violent charges at the 5-year mark. So that's somewhat promising in terms of long-term effects. So again, kind of going with the translational science aspect and the implementation science aspect, what I have found to be the aspects that I need to focus on the most now as the program grows is more now into the context in which active is occurring. So for example, the evidence is pretty clear that you shouldn't mix low-risk offenders and high-risk offenders in the same group. So for example, someone who has no criminal history, kind of no general criminal risk factors, would be considered low risk. High-risk offenders would be those that have a strong criminal history, have a lot of risk factors like lack of employment, they're not married, younger age, racial characteristics can be factored in there. And so they would be high risk. Well, you're not supposed to mix those people in the same group, because what happens is the high risk folks kind of serve as a contagion for the low risk folks. And now you've got all these, potentially never going to commit a crime again, low risk folks who now become friends with these seasoned criminals. So you're really supposed to not put them in the same group. Well, right now, BIPs, or the way that it was, is that with Batterers intervention program, including active, they would just mix them all together. So I'm working with the districts now to separate out low risk and high risk folks so that they have separate groups, so that we don't have that contagion effect. I already talked a lot about how, corrections officers kind of lean toward the punitiveness. And so, me sort of working with them to sort of try to let that go. I'll talk more about that in a minute. Quality control and fidelity is a huge ongoing issue that I could, again, give another hour talk on, so I won't really talk much about that. But quality, or being competent and having fidelity to the program, is extremely important, which I'm sure is true of every program. But in corrections, it's actually shown that it can increase recidivism for programs that are facilitated poorly or not with fidelity. So it's been a challenge for me recently to come up with a quality control system to provide support for areas that may have lower quality of active implementation and facilitation. You know, the eligibility for the program, you know, some people who don't speak English are referred to active, and we don't have other versions of active yet to account for that. And so me sort of working with them on how we can, you know, address those significant challenges and make sure that people who are not English speaking can, we do now have a Spanish group, but we still have to translate it into other languages. And then finally, program contracts and rules I have found to be a significant problem in terms of being at odds with the active philosophy. So I'm going to give you an example here on the next slide. This is actual contract that was sent to me. This is from the Mount Pleasant Correctional Facility. They sent this to me to look at, to get my approval. They do this all the time. They send me these things and just say, Dr. Zarling, do you approve this? And I'm like, what? But this is an example where they sent me this active treatment contract. They wanted everyone who was inactive at the Mount Pleasant facility to sign. And I was just shocked as I was reading it. Like every single line, I was like, no, 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 don't say this, no. I mean, the very first number, I must be completely honest in group and actively participate in group to the satisfaction of staff. This was to say of staff. And I was like, no, that's coercive, and I do not put that. So the next one, you know, you can't be 5 minutes late, or it's an unexcused absence. We do not allow unexcused absences, or you'll be removed from group. And I was sort of like, well, wait, these are people who are in prison because they, you know, don't know how to regulate their behavior in some sense. And so you're basically punishing them for showing the exact behavior of why they're here and what you're supposed to be helping them with. So these types of things come up all the time, where I sort of need to show them the evidence-based ways of behavior change, because that's really my expertise, is how to get people to change their behavior effectively. And it's me training the staff on how to, again, it's a lot of letting go of that punitiveness and thinking about what is going to be most effective for changing this person's behavior instead of looking at it from a punishment angle. So that's a lot of what I do. And I completely revamped this contract, by the way. It looks very different now. And another thing that's a vestige of, you know, other correctional programs is they must take 100% complete accountability for their crimes, or they cannot continue in the program. And that to me is pointless, because research has not shown that taking 100% verbally, taking responsibility, or, you know, being accountable for your crimes verbally, like admitting it, is not at all related to recidivism. So to me, the time that they waste getting the clients to admit to, or, you know, verbally take accountability for what they did, to me, it's a waste of time. And it often just frustrates the clients and the facilitators and ruptures that relationship, which ends up backfiring and leading to a lack of behavior change. Anyway, that's a whole nother talk, but that's a lot of what I spend my time on. So yeah, there are other versions of active now. My great relationship with the Department of Corrections has led to 3 additional versions of active. I'm not going to talk about them today, but I ended up making an active program specifically for the prison, just because they have different needs, in the sense that they run sessions twice a week instead of once. So that kind of needed to change the session structure. So I worked with them, the task force. So there's a specific program for the prisons. I created an additional 12 sessions for extremely high risk offenders, because they need additional content, additional weeks. So 36 weeks for them instead of 24. And then I also recently finished a program specifically for justice involved women. Active is trauma informed just as it is, but for the women, we kind of needed to take it up a notch and make it even more. So those are the additional versions that I'm working on researching. And then in terms of the last thing I'll talk about is the impact on policy. So a couple years ago, the term Batterers Intervention Program in Iowa was replaced with Iowa Domestic Abuse Program. So now it's called IDAP. I still call it BIP just because in my research, because that's what people in the field, in the research field, will search for when they're searching for research on these types of programs. So I still use that in my research articles, but within the Department of Corrections and written into Iowa law is now Iowa Domestic Abuse Program, instead of labeling the perpetrators, labeling them with a name like batterer, because that's not good. The standards, state mandated standards for BIPs used to say that that power and control had to be addressed as the only cause of violence. That has now been scrapped. These interventions are now allowed to address trauma and emotion, as ACTIV does. And then just the general move from punishment to more rehabilitation within these programs has been the impact on policy. And then finally, the last thing, I wanted to just talk a little bit about what I've learned about translating research into practice. And for me personally, in this particular field and what I'm doing, it's getting out there and getting on the front lines and talking to people who are on the front lines, and being okay with people being hostile toward you, because I mean, I've stood in front of 40 line staff at trainings and had half of them just mad to be there. And not necessarily mad about ACTIV per se, but the fact that they have to learn another program and they have to spend 3 days doing this, and why does it have to be this? And then once they start learning about it, then they kind of take their frustration out on the program and sort of just rolling with that resistance, which is what we then teach them to do with clients too. So again, there's a lot of parallel processes with the staff and the clients. A lot of resistance and lack of motivation that I work with the staff in the same way that, and I model for the staff the same way that I want them to work with the clients in their groups. So you really got to be okay with people being hostile and angry. And I have learned to do that over the years. And listen to their needs and concerns and really nurture that relationship and build trust. And like I said, I did that at both the bottom, in the sense I did that with the line staff, but then I also did that with administration and Department of Corrections central office, which now the Department of Corrections is led by Dr. Beth Skinner, and she and I have a very close and trusting relationship in which we can have the collaborative research and practice based mutually beneficial relationship that we do. And then finally, I just wanted to put the 3 funded projects I'm working on right now. Implement a lot of it now is focused on the prisons, just because that has started happening a lot in the last few years. So I've got a couple projects in the prisons, and then my randomized controlled trial in Des Moines is now derailed because of COVID. And I'm now creating another version of ACTIV that can be done, virtually. So I've been trying to scramble to do that the past 4 weeks. Because in-person groups, they don't know when they'll be able to resume those. So I've been scrambling to create a version that can be done over the phone or Zoom for clients who are mandated to complete it. And that's all. And does anyone have any questions or comments?
I'll jump in, Amy. That was fabulous. This is Greg. So if I don't have my ability hand waving with Zoom, but if I could, I would right now through my phone. But yeah, that was fabulous. So yeah, I learned a lot, and I love the fact that you've been able to adapt it and modify it, and now that its latest phase would be moving it to virtual. That was going to be one of my questions, and you just kind of alluded to that. My other question, I guess, is how transferable are the communication skills to many other conditions? So the motivational interviewing is this hub that I've been working on, and we've just finally got that training built into Learn at ISU, and we're really excited to roll that out, and might have opportunities to roll it out and train clinicians in how to counsel patients. But it sounds like a similar kind of conversation, a strategy that could have broader application than in this context. But so what's your thought on that? Like how it could relate to training other staff or clinicians or populations, coaches, any population we can think of that needs to, police officers. So we actually trained police officers in motivational interviewing, if you can fathom that, because they found it better or more effective at going into parties and disrupting like negative behaviors if they could get them to talk instead of talking at them.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think ACTIV itself, ACT itself, like I mentioned, is transdiagnostic and is being used in so many arenas. And motivational interviewing is kind of baked into ACTIV, but I think it's helpful to pull it out and specifically focus on those skills. So actually, I didn't say this, but most correctional staff do have training in motivational interviewing separately from active. Now, how well they're using that is sort of a different thing. But the Department of Correction does in general, like, believe in motivational interviewing and want people to use that approach. So I feel like active kind of goes a step further. Like, again, I sort of assume everyone has it. Again, not everyone was trained in a super effective way, but I feel like active takes it a step further almost, and I try to differentiate it and be a little bit more than motivational interviewing, in the sense of, let's move this to what triggers your violent behavior. And I still have to use the motivational interviewing skills, but now we got to move it to what triggers your violent behavior. What skills can you do differently?
Right. Sure.
So I don't know. I think it's, to answer your question specifically, I think it's broadly applicable. I think these principles can be used everywhere. I mean, in education, I mean, I use it in my teaching. Yeah, there's lots of books on using this with coaching. So yeah, I think you're right on that. It's broadly applicable for sure. And I'm just trying to focus on how, like, what are the corrections specific ways I can make this work, even though I am interested at a more broad level, if that makes sense. Like, I didn't necessarily start off thinking I'd be in corrections. I wasn't necessarily like going for that. And that's where I find myself, but I definitely don't, think that it only applies here.
Yeah, it's great. And I hope this helped me get the sense of the scale that you've talked to me about before, of how to scale this and sustain it. And, to the extent that we can keep your work manageable as you keep scaling it, that'd be a good task or challenge for U-Turn. So yeah, I'll let others jump in and kind of.
This is Chad Higgins. Just curious, and I had to take a phone call, and you may have gone over this in my absence. What about thoughts around adjudicated youth? The earlier the better type of intervention is suitable for younger participants as well.
Yeah, so we've had a few. I have about 3 trainings per year that I do the active pre-service, and we have had individuals who are staff at the juvenile justice facilities attend those trainings, and there's interest. I don't think it's been broadly adopted yet by those facilities. It could be, though. I wrote active at about a 5th grade reading level, just because, and that might even be too much for adjudicated youth, but it wouldn't need to be adjusted, I don't think, too much. And I have an interest in doing that for sure. So yeah, it's on my to-do list, and they've reached out to me, and it's just a matter of me, cloning myself and being able to, like, I want to spend that time with them, and I want to get to know their needs, and I want to do all the things that I mentioned that I did with the Department of Corrections. Like, I want to do all that for them too. And that just requires carving out quite a bit of time to do that appropriately, but I want to do that someday.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So Amie, a couple things you said really resonated. Well, a lot of things actually resonated with me. So I really appreciate your comments today, just thinking about how important those relationships are, how much persistence it takes, but really that your intervention isn't only at the individual level. So I was so interested when you talked about the impact it's had on facilitators, and my mind started to go to just really, I imagine that you're making an organizational and a system change. So I appreciated your comments about how policy has now been impacted by your work too. Mm-hmm. Have you collected any data, or anecdotally have you seen organizational changes with some of the maybe early adopter programs and those organizations as a whole?
Yeah, so no, I wish I had data. I don't. I have been racking my brain of how to do it. Like one idea I had is that some residential facilities, which I didn't really talk much about today because so residential facilities are in between community-based corrections and prisons. So they're otherwise known as like halfway houses. So I think they're the places where I can more easily collect data on culture change, because the residential facility in Des Moines, it's called the Fort. It's by the zoo, by Blank Park Zoo. If you guys have ever seen those, like all those buildings at the Fort, that's the residential facility. And they are talking about like actually implementing active as a culture change, like for their staff. And so that is the way that I'm working on getting that study up and going now. And that is the way that I think is the best way that I could get reliable data on if this changes, like the things you're talking about.
Right.
Broader scale, I just don't think it's possible. Because, they're learning about all sorts of other things at the same time too, right? Like, there's a new treatment out called moral recognition therapy, and like they're rolling that out in the prisons, and they've been doing that for the past couple of years. And so like, it's really hard for me to pinpoint and pull out what has been the effect of active per se. So I think something like the residential facilities, which are more contained, but are not the prisons, because the prisons are hard to get into. I mean, I'm doing 2 studies in the prisons, but especially now with the virus, they're very hard to get into. Residential facilities are kind of this more easier way to get into a contained area, a contained culture, and assess if training the staff has an impact.
Right.
That is where staff actually end up being the most punitive, are at those residential facilities. It's not good.
That's so interesting. I think it would be, it seems like an incredible opportunity to get some of that organizational data at the front end of it too. And just their willingness to partner with you on that. It just seems so obvious, the big changes that you're making. It's just a matter of capturing it.
I know, and it is obvious, but you wouldn't believe how hard it is for them to do these things. Like, you would think it's a no-brainer that wagging your finger at someone and telling them that they're a psychopath isn't going to change their behavior, but they do it every day.
Right.
And it's just, so to me, that's about helping them change their mindset and their behavior so that they can change the client's behavior. It's like it's a 2-level system.
And now that you have so many programs, starting to evolve and get up and going, it also just makes me think about looking at kind of predictive models of characteristics of facilities and facilitators that are, connected to best outcomes. And that might be a different way, not a causal way, but a way to get at some of the most important pieces of this work.
Yeah, I've thought about doing that before, and one of the biggest barriers to that, not that I couldn't do it, but I think I would need to potentially get funding or something for it, because facilitators move around a lot. So for example, there's a lot of groups at night. Well, line staff may only be 3 months. Okay, 3 months you've got the night shift, for example. So they do their 3 months of having the 7 o'clock group on Tuesday nights. They kind of do their duty, and then they're off night shift for a while. Well, what that means is that facilitators are sort of revolving door through the groups. And so I couldn't match it to client outcomes in the way that you're describing. I think if I got funded, I could figure out a way to do it, because then I could like pay the people to just stay in the same groups, right? But that is my challenge, because I've thought of that before, and that's been my challenge, linking facilitators to client outcomes. If only they would just do it the way that I wanted them to.
Well, you have made some impressive progress, I think, in I'm sure it feels like a long time, but in the world of implementation science, it's not so long that you have scaled up this program in this way. So I think you might be the person for the task to take that on, as next steps over the next series of years.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, in some ways it's gone faster than I can keep up with it.
Yeah, I was going to say, this is Greg again, that's the strongest evidence you have, is that people are contacting you and wanting more, and they're coming back, and you've made converts of these people when they see it applied in their own lives and then see it working. So that's really cool that you just persisted on holding them, or to that process. And so yeah, fabulous.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I get emails daily from other states who want it, and I just have to say no, because I want to make sure I get the randomized controlled trials done first. But then I know that, if I'm going to publish all that, I need to be able to tell people how they can get the program. So I've got a lot of work ahead of me.
Well, that's where I think our U-turn can help. So we can, I bet there's people out there that would love to build on this kind of work and support it and grow it. And maybe, again, that's where teamwork comes into play. So we could help on multi-state grants, or that's similar to the Prosper model, for example, that went multi-state. So we have examples of how to do that. It's just, like you said, cloning yourself, or dividing and conquering. And I think we're all willing to help. So this is a fabulous platform for us to build on in U-turn.
Yeah, well, that's awesome. I'm so glad, because I've needed something like this, and just, yeah.
Great.
Well, thank you, Amie. I will say I have personally loved this, but I think it's been just a really engaging, thought-provoking discussion for those who are able to attend today, pushing through here at the end of the semester. So a great finale, I think, for our Engaged Scholars Talks for this semester, and we will take back up in these meetings beginning in the fall. So thank you all for joining us.
Yep. Thanks again.
Yep. Thanks for having me, everybody.